To start with, half of the comments are already, did you know that technically all Western writing traditions are ultimately from the Phoenician alphabet? Yes, I know. What I want to dispute in this video is the notion, which has become more and more popular lately, that runes are directly derived from contact with Phoenician speakers. This is impossible for a variety of reasons. Now, today we're at Dinosaur Ridge in Morrison, Colorado, where there is a series of strata with fossils from several different periods into two different sides. So here on the first side, it's largely Jurassic fossils, which are older. As we go higher in the rocks, we actually get to Cretaceous fossils, which are a little bit later. All writing systems have fossils in them of different stages of transmission from different speakers of different languages using different alphabets, and runes are no exception. They have too many fossils of alphabets that come after the Phoenician alphabet. Now, these are Jurassic dinosaur fossils, and as I said, most alphabets have fossils of how they were transmitted. So for example, English has fossils of the fact that it's been that are the way we use the Roman alphabet. The Roman alphabet is a Roman adaptation of an Etruscan adaptation of a Greek adaptation of the Phoenician system. And we have traces of the Etruscan system in English today. The history of the alphabet in a few minutes. Luke Gordon and I have 3 whole videos about this, but Phoenicians adapt Egyptian hieroglyphs to write consonant sounds. So they take, for example, a Greek hieroglyph for snake, and that becomes, I believe, the letter N. Now for the Phoenicians, it just stands for the consonant N. They don't have any signs for vowels. They just write consonants, and that works fine for a Semitic language like Phoenician or Hebrew or Arabic, where you have consonant templates that have pretty consistent meanings in spite of whatever vowels you put into them. It doesn't work very well for an Indo-European language like English or Greek, where vowels often distinguish different words that have very, very different meanings. So consider, look at what I'm writing on screen for you here. It's just consonants. Can you tell what that means? Maybe you can. It's a very famous phrase. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. But it's pretty hard to read English without vowels. And English is actually one of the easier languages to do this with. It's much harder with Greek or with Proto-Germanic, the first language that runes wrote, because in those languages often vowel endings distinguish words from each other. Now, Greeks take that Phoenician alphabet or abjad for just writing consonants, and they take some of the consonant letters they don't need and start writing vowels with them. And that is the first true alphabet, right? All the sounds of the language can be written now. This invention, as far as we know, has only happened independently twice. The Greeks adapting Phoenician letters and Koreans adapting Chinese symbols. So all Western writing is ultimately descended from that Greek adaptation of the Phoenician abjad to make a true alphabet. Now, the Greek alphabet existed in many, many different local scripts. We know just the form that was used by originally the Ionians and later the Athenians, this Eastern form. That's what we see on like our sorority, fraternity signs. But there were, every town in Greece, every polis, every ethne had its own particular Greek alphabet. They all are related. They all come from one common innovation. They all use the same vowel letters, basically. But they use a lot of consonant letters differently. Sometimes they keep more of the Phoenician alphabet, sometimes they keep less of it, sometimes they add more letters that aren't in the Phoenician alphabet. There's a lot of variation. The Roman alphabet, the one we use today, actually comes from an Etruscan adaptation of a Western Boeotian Greek alphabet. Now, this is different from the one that we know from sororities and fraternities and from, if you take Plato or New Testament Greek in college. For one thing, the letter rho doesn't look like a P, it looks like an R. So that actually comes from that Western alphabet. The letter that looks like an X doesn't stand for K, it stands for X. So of course we get that too. And then the Etruscans are the ones who teach the Romans to write, and they adapt this alphabet further. For example, as I said, they use the C, K, and Q in 3 different ways. Q only comes before U. That's why we use Q before U. And they don't have a G sound, so they adapt the letter gamma, G, as another K sound. So any alphabet that uses something that looks like a C, that's the old gamma flipped, that comes somehow through Etruscan mediation. Does that make some sense?
Yes.
Okay. That's in a nutshell. We have 3 long videos about this, Luke Gordon and I do. Okay, so I'm not disputing that ultimately runes are borrowed from something derived from the Phoenician alphabet. They're not derived directly from the Phoenician alphabet. Now, we know that Phoenicians came to northwestern Europe. Now, that probably means like France, not Scandinavia. Hamilco in 500 BC is looking for tin and probably gets to like northwestern France. Are there direct contacts between Phoenician speakers and Germanic speakers? Maybe. I mean, amber was traded down to the Mediterranean 1,000 years before that, right? You know, King Tutankhamun, who died in 1300 something BC, has Baltic amber in his grave. But the letter shapes and runes don't look particularly like Phoenician, and they have alphabetical values. They have symbols for vowels, which shows they come at least from Greek mediation. Okay, so if we look at the Phoenician abjad, again, not technically an alphabet because it doesn't mark vowels, and put that next to the earliest version of the runes, the Elder Futhark, yes, some letters arbitrarily look similar. For example, Phoenician Gimel, which stands for the G sound, looks like the rune Lagus, which stands for the L sound. But just similar shaped signs that don't mean similar things doesn't really tell us anything. We'd want the sign to mean the same thing and be shaped similar. Now put Elder Futhark runes next to alphabets, right? So at least Greek is the earliest level, and then you have Etruscan, then you have Roman levels, and you see letters that look the same. For example, the rune B looks like B in Greek and Etruscan and Roman. And in fact, there's a very early variation in B where you get a lot of, like sometimes you get like 4 bins instead of 2. For example, in the very earliest rune inscription that we know of, the Idibarric inscription, the B has like 8. That kind of variation is very common in Greek. So even the variation is sort of typical. The K sound looks like a C, which again, that requires at least Etruscan or Roman, someone Italian who's learned to write from Etruscans has influenced this alphabet. The F looks like a Roman F. Actually, that has to come from somewhere in Italy. Let me interrupt this video by telling you about some ways you can support this channel. You can go to grimfrost.com and support my friends and partners there by buying their awesome replica Viking stuff and their rune merch that actually uses the right runes for Old Norse, Younger Futhark, not the Elder Futhark I'm talking about in this video. And you can join patreon.com/Norse by Southwest, especially at the Scald tier, where you can see live updates about my new translation of the Prose Edda and my massively revised and expanded second edition of the Poetic Edda. You can also take my classes in Old Norse language and myth offered through Eventbrite. There's Zoom classes. You can take them from anywhere in the world. Check out the links in the pinned comment below. The R looks like an R, again in Western Greek alphabets or Etruscan or Roman. T looks like T, right? U looks like U flipped upside down. Whatever the specific alphabet that gave us runes, that runes are adapted from, they're adapted from the alphabet, not directly from Phoenician letters, where there's no similarity of shape and sound between the 2 systems. So there's not a trace of direct contact between Phoenicians and Germanic speakers either in the archaeological and linguistic record. Again, not to say they could never have met in the Baltic trade or something, or in the quest of the Phoenicians for tin, but they could have met, and so could tons of other people of ancient Europe, Africa, the Near East. Why didn't all of them adapt the Phoenician alphabet as an alphabet? As far as we know, that happened only one time in Greece. So it's not directly from Phoenicians, could be from Greeks, but I still think with Greeks and Phoenicians, you have a timeline problem, right? The earliest runic inscriptions that we know of now, only recently, have been dated to the first millennium BC. So, 100 BC or later. It's probably like 50 BC, 25 BC. The Phoenicians are exploring, their height is like 500 BC. That's like Himilco. There's a lot of space there. Now, there is a possible case of Etruscan contact with Germanic speakers because we have the Negau helmet from about 300 BC. This is the earliest known writing of a Germanic name. It says Haragastitiwa. Probably Haragast is the priest. Haragast would be like Hergaster in Old Norse. It's war guest, typical Germanic name. That name might be in the vocative. That would actually make some sense. It's addressed to him. And that's written in a form of the Etruscan alphabet that could pretty plausibly be a forerunner to the runic alphabet. It isn't necessarily. It could just be an isolated writing of a Germanic name by an Etruscan or other, Venetic or something speaker. But it at least shows us contact and use of writing. So, I am very, very interested in the question of where the runes come from. But I want to be honest about it, right? I don't need to glorify anybody. I don't need to make up some story that like, it's invented ab novo, right? That someone, some god or some person like independently came up with the idea of writing in Northern Europe. I think that's pretty hard to sustain. And I also don't think that it has to be the maximally old thing where it's borrowed from Phoenicians, the first people to make up an abjad, to represent sounds rather than words by writing. But, again, let's be honest about this. It's interesting that you could say that, Phoenician Gimel looks like, Elderfudar Lagus, the L sound, but they don't have the same sound. So what case is there for this? We need to look for, lots of similarities. And we have lots of similarities primarily to Alpine adaptations of the Etruscan alphabet for writing languages like Venetic. In fact, if you want to look for Phoenician loanwords in Old Norse, you're going to find none. If you want to look for Celtic loanwords, you're going to find a lot. And a very similar alphabet to the runes is used by speakers of Lepontic, an Alpine Celtic language. In fact, one letter, the D letter, pretty much you can only get from there. I think that's a pretty good case for something like that being the source. A nearby people, the speakers of Venetic, have a goddess of writing whose name is Writia. I'm not going to say that that's the origin of the word write, but it's not an impossible case. And a lot of early inscriptions in Venetic are addressed to her as the goddess of writing. I think they learned to write from people in the Alps. We know there's Germanic speakers there. On the Negau helmet, we have writing in Alpine alphabets very early on with Germanic text in it. I have interviews on this channel with Karina Salomon and David Stifter about this possibility, which you can follow up much more detail about these questions. The letter I in runes is a straight line that looks like an I. It's Greeks who straightened it out. The Phoenician one looks like a Z, and it's only used for the consonant ya. It's the Greeks who used it as a vowel. And by the way, runes distinguish the vowel I from the consonant ya. The rune letter R looks like an R. It has that extra diagonal line that was added by Western Greeks. So let's use Occam's razor here, right? Let's not explain in a really complicated way what we can explain in a simple way. Early Germanic speakers didn't borrow the Phoenician abjad, independently come up with the idea of it being an alphabet where they could write vowels too, independently use the same Phoenician signs for vowels as the Greeks did, and then independently do stuff like straighten out the I, add the diagonal line to the R, make the T look like a T rather than an X, right? All the stuff didn't independently happen. That's not the simplest explanation. No, the simplest explanation is that they borrowed the alphabet from someone who already used it as an alphabet. Now, scholars are going to disagree about who that was. You can definitely make a case for some early form, probably not the late, imperial form of the Roman alphabet. You can make a case for an Alpine adaptation of a Western Greek alphabet. That's what I favor. You can make other cases, but the Phoenician case is pretty weak. It belongs in a museum. Well, from beautiful Colorado with beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best. So you're off and around when I'm doing the classes. Any thoughts about any of them?
I like the myth class.
Yeah? For
Yeah.
what? What do you like about it?
Well, I mean, you're so passionate about Havamal specifically, and you get all the detail behind the stories and how people interpret it differently and what it really says word for word. So I found that really interesting. It's like you feel more about the story.
Well, thanks. And you know she's going to be objective about it.